Welcome back to the channel, guys. So I've had some spare time and I've started work on the 33 again, so I'm just getting prepped to put the engine back in. So I thought I'd give you a bit of insight into what you need to do before you put the engine in to make the job easier for yourself. So from the factory Nissan point of view, usually you have a power steering reservoir over here and some hard lines that go on the rack. You won't need that with the Barra because the Ford has it all on the front, and then you can just run the fittings off it. So we can pull all that out of it, and then just keep the 33 is pretty lucky because it's got a banjo bolt and there's a barb on it, so we can just cut the Ford power line and run it straight into here. And then I've just cut the return, but we're going to replace that with a banjo bolt with a bung, so then we can run the return into this factory barb here. So we're just going to run a high pressure power steering hose all the way back into there for the return, and the feed's going to come out of the factory line with the sensor in it, and then we're going to cut it to run it into that rack. Then the only other thing that would be much easier to do outside of the car would be to convert your 3/4 master. So this is a Willwood one, and then I've got the adapter in and it's all bolted to the pedal, so I'll show you that outside of the car. But with the engine bay out, with the engine out, it's much easier to do this than it is trying to fumble around with everything in the car. And then you can also see that I've got the Crossmember Spaces in. You can see the cross members in here, but I'll show you them through the wheel well. So yeah, I've started putting the front suspension back together. So it's got the plate lower control arms and the curved cast rods, but what I did is, you can probably see the weld there. I've welded the 16mm spacer to the crossmember while I was doing the rack forward, and then I've just got, I don't know if you can see it, the 10's still silver. So I've got 26mm rack spacers in this car. You can get away with 16 and a 33. The only other thing that needs to be removed to fit a Barra in is the front sway bar. You can see this car has no front sway bar. With how big the sump is, it's actually pretty large compared to an RB one. The sway bar pretty much sits in the middle of it, so you can't, like if you put a Barra in an AU for example, you notch the front because it just touches the front, but you can't do that with a Skyline because it's pretty much dead bang in the center of the pickup. So the easiest solution for now is just remove it, and then I'll look at getting an aftermarket one made that's much further forward. It's going to have to be like 150mm further forward in the crossbar to be able to bolt in like factories. So we'll go through some of the parts that you'll need. So I've just got the RB20 type and RB25 type engine conversion brackets, the clutch master conversion adapters, then all the pedal brackets, so a BA, BF and an FG. So I'll show you the difference in them so you can work out what pedal you have for which bracket you need. And then the 25mm and the 16mm crossmember spaces, so we can go through that. But first things first, you want to convert your Skyline to Barra, so you need to know what crossmember's in it. If you've got a 31, it's very easy to tell because 173mm bolt spacing, and the crossmember is threaded, whereas all the import ones are just a clearance hole and the thread's actually in the mount. So 31's being Australian delivered, it's just a saddle with a hole in it, and then the thread's actually in the crossmember, and you bolt the rack in that way. And they usually have this big big cutout in the back of the bracket, so you can see that that's roughly 45 degrees, which is the same as this one, and then this one's pretty flat, it's at like 15 degrees. I'll see if I can get a better picture for you guys. So you can see that's pretty flat, and then that's at roughly 45 degrees, which this one's also roughly at 45 degrees. So this one's a 31, this one's a 32 or Safiro or Laurel or R33 non-turbo. So the R33 non-turbo bit's the bit that's stuffing everybody up, but we'll get into that a bit later. And if you have the 2 bolt holes and it's fairly flat, that's a 33 or 34 turbo crossmember. So the 2 bolt holes is the key, whereas all the RB20 type or 33 non-turbos are slot, and the 31 one's a slot. So the other easy way to tell is look at the engine mounts that are in your car if you got them. If you have this square rubber block type mount, it is predominantly RB30 RB20 or RB25 non-turbo, and they'll go into these ones with one single hole in it. So they get used on 3 different types of motors. If you have this rounded type mount with the 2 pins in the bottom, that's 25 turbo, so it'll be on your 33 turbo or 34 turbo, and they go in to the mount with the 2 bolt holes in it. So they usually sit like that with a strap towards the inside, but we've got to change it so the strap's on the outside when we do the barra conversion. So hopefully that's gives you an idea of what you need to look at before you go look at the brackets. And obviously the brackets are corresponding, so you can see this has a fairly low angle because when it sits on this one it's at a fairly low angle, and then when your RB20 or RB30 type bracket is roughly 45 degrees, because it'll sit on this one at roughly 45 degrees. So that's it. Probably the key thing is to work out what cross members in your car, because I know I listed them for R32 type and R33 type, or RB20 30 type and RB25 type, but with the 33s there is a big crossover. A lot of them have this cross member, and they might have come out non-turbo, but you currently have a turbo motor in it, so you think it's a turbo. So you think you need the turbo brackets or the RB25 brackets, but you buy the brackets with the low angle, and then you get a problem here because you've got the 45 degree angle type cross member, and you gotta message me and we're gonna do an exchange, which is no drama, but I'm sure adding a couple of days to your conversion is probably not what you want to do. You probably want to do it all in one weekend. So if we can work out what cross members are in the cars before we order, that'd be greatly appreciated. So then we will move over into Crossmember Spaces. So this is the factory crossmember pin that comes out of your Skyline, and then these are the aftermarket ones. You can see there is a good inch extra on them to cover for the spaces, so you won't be able to run any spaces on this pin, because on the thread projection you only get your 3 threads or 6mm or whatever it is, depending on the pitch of the thread hanging out of the nut. So that'll allow you to keep them tight during vibration, but with the spaces I supply new pins. So we have 26mm spaces or we have 60mm spaces. If you run an R31 crossmember, you know, the 45 degrees, the holes in the mounts and the cutout in the back, you will not need any spaces. You'll put a barra in your engine bay, no dramas. If you run an R32 or Saphira or Laurel or non-turbo 33s crossmember, the one with the 45 degrees, you will need the 26mm spaces. So when you go to putting spaces on in the car, you can just imagine the chassis rail here. So you're going to put, to start off with, you're going to put the pin through the chassis rail and have the studs hanging out the bottom, and then when you lift up the crossmember, just sit the spaces on it above the holes, and then just lift it all up and line it up with the pins, and then put the washer on the nut on the bottom and then tighten it up. So you'll have to do it on both sides. But then if you run this 25mm turbo, RB25 turbo crossmember, you will only need the 16mm spacer. So you'll only need the thick one. So people do put 25mm spacers in their 33s. I've done it as well as a lot of other guys have done it. There is minimal clearance between the hood and your barra. Barras are really tall motors. They're also really heavy. So it probably helps a little bit to have a bit more space. But it's up to you. You only really need the 16mm spacer on this crossmember to get the barra under the bonnet. But an extra space wouldn't hurt. So they're the 2 crossmember spaces I sell, and that's the crossmembers that they suit. So you probably noticed so far I haven't shown an S chassis crossmember. You get a lot of people asking about putting barras in S13s, S14s. So the problem with an S chassis crossmember is it's similar to this, but this mount is 80mm on the back. So when we put the exhaust through, it's very tight to get it past the steering shaft and past this mount. So I usually tell everybody to swap to one of these 2 crossmembers, depending on what you can find at a reasonable price locally. Don't go spend too much money on them, because usually you can pick these up for $50, but if people want much more than that, to an extent, it doesn't matter which one it is, as long as you can get one, because as long as you can get the mounts to suit it as well, then you can run the conversion in an S chassis. It doesn't really matter what crossmember it is, because you just got to buy all the corresponding bits for the crossmember. So hopefully that clears up a bit about the spaces and which crossmembers you need. Now we need to work out what pedal you have, in case you don't know. So a lot of people just buy a conversion kit and they're told one thing, but 90% of the time that's correct, but there are a few people out there that try to claim that they have something that they don't. So we need to decipher what you've actually got. So see this pedal, plug on the back, flat on one side except for the pivot, and then flat on this side except for the pivot, and then it has 3 mounting bolts. So it's got 3 through-holes where I can put bolts through. This is a BA pedal, and this is a BA pedal bracket. So that's pretty easy. And then this one, plug on the back, flat on one side with 3 mounting holes as well, and then it's got this big box on the side. So this is a BF pedal. So then we have a different bracket, which is much more rigid than a BA bracket. BA bracket was the original bracket before we went and built a BF bracket. So if you have this box, you need the BF bracket, but this BF bracket will also suit a BA pedal. So if you think you've got a heavy foot, or you're going to be constantly mashing the pedal and you're worried about flex, because these are all 2mm steel, you're probably better off buying a BF pedal, because it's got the extra flanges in it and it's much more rigid than a BA pedal. But if you're just cruising around and everything and you're not too much of a heavy foot, then the BA pedal won't flex at all. So the other interesting thing is they both have a steel pedal shaft. So this one, the third one, is the BF pedal. So you can see much different shape. It's not like a big triangular type thing like this. It's much more flat, and it's got this much thicker pedal, and it's all plastic. So it's got a honeycomb in the back, and it's very light. So this is the bracket we need, and it has 3 bolt holes in the top instead of 3 bolt holes through the side, and the plug's actually in the front of the pedal instead of out the back of the pedal. Well, technically they're all in the front, but don't worry about that. But yeah, so this is an FG pedal, and it has this FG pedal bracket. Got a few dimple dies just so I can put some rigidity in the flange, but hopefully that makes it a bit easier for you guys to work out what it is that you've got. So just remember, this BF pedal bracket will also sit on a BA pedal, but if it's got 3 holes through it, through the sides, it's either a BA or a BF, and the BF has the box. But if it's got 3 holes through the top and it's got a plastic stem, it's an FG pedal, so you'll need the FG pedal bracket. And then we move over to engine brackets. So as discussed earlier, the 45-degree angles suit RB30 or R31s or R32 type crossmembers, and they have this square mount. So I made these so that they fit on, goes this way, fit on a factory mount, so you can reuse your Nissan engine mounts if you so choose to, or you can run aftermarket urethane ones or whatever. But you see there's a slot, so you can adjust where it's going forwards and backwards in the engine bay to line the gearbox hole up with the hole in the tunnel. We're pretty lucky with the Fords that the T5 and the TR6060 can line up with the tunnel by just adjusting 10 to 15mm on the engine bracket. So you might have to pull the engine forward depending on what you've got, but if it's 45 degrees, it runs a square mount and it sits on the crossmember with the fairly steep angle. And then there's 2 types of base plates. So you'll see this one has this jut out on it. That's to clear the oil filter. So this goes on the passenger side of the car. And then you can see this one is square. It has no jut out on it, and the pattern is even. So these are in line and these are in line, where this one hole is further out, so it's not straight. So this is the driver's side. Another easy way to tell is when I built them, all the stiffeners are on the back side of the motor. So when they go on the car, like this is the passenger side, if you can imagine it tilted up, that's on the back side of the motor, and this is the driver's side, and that's on the back side of the motor. So that's the 20 or 30 type ones, and then these are the RB25 type ones. So you can see 15 degrees angle, much flatter to suit the other cross members, and then that's the jut out, and you can see the holes are not in line, and the gussets on the back. So this is the passenger side, and then this one's square, and the gussets on the back, so this is the driver's side. The trick to when you use these brackets, you'll have this engine mount. There's usually a pin here for the aluminium bracket from the RB25, just so it locates. It's got a dowel there, so you'll have to cut that dowel off and grind it flush. So when they're in the car, usually they have the strap towards the center of the car, but when we run the Barra, we'll need the strap towards the outside of the car, so closer to the chassis rail. So flip them around, grind the pin off, and then you can easily sit the bracket on and then bolt it down. And again, it's got 15mm slots, so we can line up the gearbox with a tunnel, no dramas, and Bob's your uncle. The other trick to when you're fitting the engine to the car, once you've got all your crossmember spaces in and your crossmember back in and all that jazz and your clutch master on, is that just start these bolts on one side. So one side you can do up tight. I usually do the passenger side up tight and the passenger side engine mount up tight in the crossmember, but then I leave the driver's side loose so you can rock it, and I just usually get these in 3 or 4 threads, so it'll hang down like so on the engine, and then when you're dropping the engine in and you get it aligned, because everything's on an angle, it's not like as easy it would be if everything was vertical, so straight up and down. So what you've got to do is it'll come in and it'll sit about here somewhere on the bracket when it comes down, but then you can rock this back and then rock the engine mount up so you can get it so it's pretty much vertical, and then it's easy to get the bracket to slide down over while it's rocked up vertical, and then once it's all sitting down in place, it'll sit down and you can tighten everything up. So it just makes life a bit easier. It's not so bad on these RB25 ones with the lower angle, like the 15-degree angle, but it's a bit difficult, especially if you're doing it by yourself on the 45-degree one. So you can get away with putting one side in tight, but the other side you got to leave loose. That or bolt. I found sometimes when I did my R31 originally that I bolted the engine mount to the bracket and then left it all loose, so then there was a lot of play in it, and then when it come down onto the crossmember I could line everything up and just let the crane down slowly so it all lined up, and then when it was all home, just give the engine a bit of a rock, so rock it side to side so it seats in with the angles, because it will try to set one side down first before the other, because one side of the engine's heavier, or it depends on how you rigged it up, it might be slightly tilted. But then just give it a good shake in the car so then it levels itself out and it sits pretty much flat with its angles. Otherwise you might tear them out because you're loading one mount up more than another. But that's just a good trick. I found it quite useful with a few of the ones that I've done. So the Fords come out factory with a 3/4 master cylinder to drive their concentric slate. Nissans, unfortunately, the biggest they do is 5/8. So some people leave them in and they claim they work with a lot of adjustment, but it might be a lot easier just from the very beginning to put a 3/4 one in. I've chosen to put a wheelwood one in. So the first thing you notice that on the wheelwood the bolts are in line with the reservoir, whereas Nissans they're at 45 degrees, sort of from upper left to lower right on that angle. So don't know if you can see it, but you can see top bolts on the top left and the bottom bolts on the lower right. So we need to make an adapter to accommodate that. So that's pretty much what this is. So it's got 2 countersunk holes in the back, so it'll sit flush up against the firewall, and then you'll bolt it on, and then you'll have the 2 bolts up and down to bolt the master cylinder in. Bolt it to the master cylinder first, because these 2 studs, the factory ones, are the ones that are in the pedal, and they're always there. So you don't need to hold the other end of them to tighten them, but these ones you'll have to have an Allen key to tighten it up on the master. So it's best to put everything on the cylinder before you fit it in. And then this is the new clevis. So it's a race type clevis. It doesn't have a pin, it has this clip that springs over the top and it suits the pedal. So once again, put this on the cylinder. The cylinder, if you buy a wheelwood cylinder, it will come with a jam nut on it, and it'll be like a 5/16 thread, which is what this is. and this is long enough to clear the back of the pedal, and then everything in there. So yeah, bolt everything to it, wind it in. I think I wound it in so the thread was just visible, so it's sort of like 3mm in on this tapped boss section, and that seems to be a good enough length. But you can adjust it in the car once it's in, because it's got a flat on the thread, so you can wind it out without having to undo this clevis. It's a bit cumbersome. I'm a big guy, lying on my back in the footwell is a pain in the ass. I pulled the seat out because I'm a big guy, but if some of you guys are a bit more nimble or a bit more flexible than me, you might be able to do it with the seat in, but it is a bit of a pain in the ass. But you need the volume of fluid to get the slave to work, so it's probably best to do it up front instead of trying to run the Nissan one and then getting a conversion line made and then finding out it's not big enough to do the job. So clearance wise in the engine bay, it's not like RB25 S13s where you're going to hammer the shit out of this part here. The Barra boxes fit really good, the 6-speed and the 5-speed. You can see here that I've got my Crossmember Spaces in, the bottoms are in, and then yeah, so I welded mine in when I did the Crossmember, or the 16mm one. The 10mm one is just sitting in there slipped in, but I made them so you could put the standard plug back in if you wanted to, so then when you're putting the Crossmember back up, the plug would hold it in and it wouldn't push the pins up as you're lifting it. And then rack wise, I run the rack 25mm forward because it's a drift car, but you don't have to. It fits without doing a rack forward. It gets pretty close to the sumps here with it not moved forward. There ends up being about 12mm clearance from the aluminium sump to here. And then the other obvious thing is, if you buy an FG motor, you will need to put a BA or BF or just a B series in general sump, because the FG motor is a rear bowl sump, so it will sit on the rack and it won't come anywhere near down low enough to fit in. So you'll need to swap everything over to a B series, because the B series is a front bowl and everything fits in this little spot here. With the adjustment, I've made it so you can't adjust the engine back far enough for the sump to foul on the front of this crossmember, and I've also made the engine brackets high enough so that the bottom of the sump sits above this crossmember. So hopefully, you know, if you go over a ripper strip or something, the crossmember is still going to take the brunt of the force, not the aluminium sump. So hopefully that's been quite helpful, and it's going to help you first determine what crossmember you've got, so you can work out what parts you need to buy. So hopefully it'll make it a bit easier for you guys to put all the Barras in your Skylines. And then also S chassis, you just got to remember to change to one of these two types of crossmembers, and you can put it in S chassis. S chassis, you will have to run the 25mm spaces regardless of which crossmember you put in the car, because the 4-cylinder engine bays are 60mm shallower than the 6-cylinder engine bays to start off with. So an RB30 engine bay from the top of the crossmember to the bonnet is taller than a 25, which a 25 is taller than a 20. So 4-cylinder ones are less than this, so you will at a minimum need the 25mm crossmembers to get the bonnet to shut. Not unless you want to cut the bonnet and be a fanboy like that. I've seen a lot do it. There's a lot in the scene that do it, but if it's a drift car, it's fine.